Somebody just accused the biggest artist on the planet of spending money to put another rapper inside a cage for a murder. Not a diss record. Not a subliminal on a throwaway track. Not a leaked snippet dropped through a blogger at 2 in the morning. A campaign. Money, allegedly moving quietly in the dark, aimed directly at one man's freedom. And the person saying it out loud is not an anonymous burner account, is not a fan page, and is not some kid farming engagement in a comment section. It is Glasses Malone, sitting in front of a camera on a live stream, saying Drake's name with his whole chest, and daring anybody breathing to walk up and correct him. And before you swipe out of here thinking this is one more recycled rap beef cycle, sit with what is actually on the table, because this is not about streaming numbers. This is not about first week sales. This is a homicide investigation. This is a rapper who was stabbed to death in front of thousands of people at a festival. This is a sworn deposition from a security guard. This is a search warrant executed in Burbank. And now this is a claim that the entire narrative you have been fed for the last 2 weeks was purchased like advertising space. That is the accusation on the table. And I am going to walk you through every single piece of it in order, with the receipts sitting right there in the open, including the part that almost nobody covering this story has been willing to touch, which is the part that flips this whole thing upside down at the end. Because once you understand the timeline, and once you understand who benefits from the timeline, this stops being a rumor and starts being one of the strangest sequences of events hip-hop has produced in years. Here is the short version before we go deep, so you know exactly what you clicked on. Glasses Malone believes Drake is financing a coordinated media campaign designed to hang the death of Drakeo the Ruler around YG's neck. He believes the bloggers pushing it are being paid to push it. He said it live. He named Drake. He did not soften it. He did not hedge it. He said it is not a conspiracy, it is a fact. And then he made a series of statements about what he could do to that man's life if he decided to stop being polite, and those statements were heavy enough that grown men in that chat went silent. Now let us build the timeline, because the timeline is the entire story, and almost every channel covering this has skipped straight to the shouting. Drakeo the Ruler was killed on December 18, 2021, backstage at the Once Upon a Time in LA festival in Exposition Park. He was 28 years old. He had just beaten a case that the district attorney's office had built against him, walked out of a cell that most people never walk out of, and had genuinely become one of the most influential stylistic voices the West Coast produced in the last 15 years. Every mumbling, sliding, off-kilter flow you hear from young artists in Los Angeles right now traces back through Drakeo the Ruler somewhere. And he was killed in a crowd, in a chaotic swarm of people, in under a minute, with cameras everywhere and somehow nobody charged. That is the wound underneath all of this. 5 years later, nobody has been charged. Not one person. A man dies in front of a stadium's worth of witnesses, and the case just sits there. Then this summer, the story cracked back open. A former security guard who worked for Drakeo the Ruler testified under oath in a deposition connected to the civil litigation around that festival, and in that testimony, he said he saw YG produce a knife and slash it toward him during the brawl where Drakeo was stabbed. That testimony was reported by the Los Angeles Times, which is not a gossip page and is not a rage bait channel, and that is when the entire internet caught fire. Shortly after that, law enforcement executed a search warrant tied to the Drakeo the Ruler homicide investigation, and YG was briefly detained and questioned in Burbank. He was released. He has never been named a suspect. He has never been charged with anything connected to that night. He has denied involvement repeatedly and consistently, and his position has been the same since 2021, which is that he learned somebody had been killed after he arrived at that festival. And then, in the middle of all of that, YG walked onto a stage and did a Verzuz against the game and dismantled him. 19-3 by most counts. A man who had just been detained and interrogated in connection with a murder investigation showed up days later and put on the most dominant Verzuz performance in the format's recent history. He even acknowledged it from the stage, essentially telling the crowd he almost did not make it there. Now hold that image, because that image is where this story turns strange. Because the moment YG survived that week, something started happening online that did not look organic. Videos began stacking up. Not one video, not two, dozens, then hundreds, all pointed at the same target, all landing in the same window, all using the same framing, all treating a deposition from one security guard as if it were a conviction. And the loudest voices driving it were not random. They were the same three names that seem to appear every single time somebody Drake does not like is in trouble. DJ Academics. Poetic Flacco. Trap Lore Ross. That is the pattern Glasses Malone is pointing at. And whether or not you believe his conclusion, you have to be honest about the pattern itself, because that pattern has been documented over and over again. When Charlemagne became a target, those same three names surfaced with the same energy, within the same window, using the same talking points. When anybody in the culture takes a public position against Drake, the content machine does not respond in a scattered way. It responds like a unit. So Glasses Malone got on a live stream and stopped dancing around it. And I want to be precise about what he actually said, because this has been misquoted everywhere in the last 48 hours. He said Drake is spending money and financing a campaign around the Drakeo'S situation specifically to interfere with YG's life and get him arrested, and he framed the motive as pettiness over a battle. He said Drake can spend that money because that is the only lever Drake has. And then Glasses Malone drew the distinction that is going to outlive this entire news cycle. He said there is a difference between real power and rented power. Rented power, in his framing, is power you pay for. You lease it. You wire the money, the machine turns on, the videos come out, the narrative moves, and the second the money stops, the power evaporates because it was never yours. Real power, in his framing, is when people move for you because of who you are and what you have actually done, with no invoice attached, no retainer, no wire transfer, and no manager coordinating the timing. And then Glasses Malone said the line that made the whole internet stop scrolling. He said he could build an entire business out of dismantling Drake publicly, that there would be nothing Drake could do about it, and that the reason nobody has called him and asked him to calm down is that everybody already knows exactly what he is holding. He also said something far heavier than that, and I am going to be responsible about how I frame it, because there is a version of this conversation that gets people hurt. He made statements suggesting that if Drake pushed him the way Drake has allegedly pushed YG, the consequences would not be digital. Those statements were extreme. They were said in anger, on a live stream, in real time, and even people who agree with the underlying argument publicly asked him to pull that part back. I am not going to amplify that portion as if it is entertainment, because a man is already dead in the story, and that is the whole reason we are here. But strip that away and you are still left with the accusation, and the accusation is enormous, because Glasses Malone is not saying Drake made a song about YG. He is saying Drake bought a narrative aimed at a homicide file. So let us take it seriously and actually test it, because that is what nobody is doing right now. The first question is motive, and this is where the story gets uncomfortable for people who want it to be simple. Drake and YG were not always enemies. They have music together. Who Do You Love is one of the records that helped make YG a national artist, and Drake is on it. There was a stretch where that relationship was public, functional, and profitable for both of them. That relationship deteriorated over the years, and by the time the Kendrick Lamar situation swallowed the entire culture, YG had made his allegiances clear, and Los Angeles as a city had made its position on him extremely clear. So there is a history there. There is a soured relationship, a public alignment against Drake by an artist Drake once used to establish credibility in that city, and a competitive humiliation that never got answered. That is not proof of anything. But motive is the first thing anybody asks in any investigation, and pretending there is no motive would be dishonest. The second question is capability, and this is where the argument gets stronger, because Drake's relationship with the blogging ecosystem is not a theory. It is one of the most documented dynamics in modern rap. There have been years of reporting, receipts, screenshots, and open jokes across the entire industry about how tightly certain platforms have operated in his interest. The running joke that Drake essentially runs a certain blogger's page did not come from nowhere. It came from watching narratives launch from one account and then spread outward in perfect formation over and over for years. There is also the Pusha T era, which nobody should ever forget because Drake publicly offered money for information during that beef. That is not an allegation. That is not a rumor from a live stream. That is a documented moment in rap history where cash was put on the table in exchange for people's private information. So when somebody says Drake is capable of financing an information campaign, the honest answer is that Drake has already demonstrated, publicly, that he will spend money to acquire and weaponize information about a rival. The third question is the only one that actually matters legally, and that is proof. And the truthful answer is that there is none in public right now. Glasses Malone did not produce a wire transfer. He did not produce a contract, a text message, an email, or a screenshot. He produced a claim, and he backed that claim with his own credibility and his own position inside the city. Now here is where I part ways with a lot of the coverage. A lot of people are dismissing what Glasses Malone said by pointing at his subscriber count. That argument is lazy, and it is also historically ignorant. Glasses Malone addressed it himself, and it was the sharpest thing he said all night. He said he has never sold millions of records, and he has never had the biggest platform, but when he speaks, the people who matter listen, and everything he says lands somewhere. He said you do not need millions of dollars to matter. And that is not just posturing. Watch what happens every single time this man opens his mouth about the industry. The conversation moves. Larger platforms react to him. Artists respond. He said something about the Doja Cat situation and the entire culture spent a week processing it. He broke down the Kendrick Lamar and Drake situation with more structural clarity than most journalists managed in a year. The people who try to reduce him to a follower count are the same people who cannot explain why his statements keep setting the agenda for accounts 20 times his size. That is the tell. That is actually the entire thesis of what he was saying about rented power versus real power, and he demonstrated it live while making the argument. Now let me get to the part that flips this entire story, because this is the piece I have not heard anybody say cleanly, and it is the reason this situation is so much darker than a blog war. If Drake is in fact financing a campaign to attach a body to YG, then Drake is doing the exact thing that would destroy Drake if it were ever done back to him with the same energy. Think about it for 1 second. We just lived through an entire era where Drake attempted to use art, lyrics, and public statements as evidence of wrongdoing. We watched a lawsuit built around the argument that a rap record should be treated as a factual accusation. That was the position. Words on a song should carry legal consequence. Now apply that standard evenly. Apply it in the other direction. Apply it to a catalog that has spent years flirting with implications about what happens to people who cross certain lines, about who can be reached, about what a phone call can accomplish. If the standard is that a lyric can be evidence, then the standard cuts everywhere. And the person pushing hardest for that standard is the person with the most to lose from it. That is the contradiction at the center of this whole thing. You cannot spend a year arguing that rap lyrics should be admissible and then finance a campaign built around a homicide investigation without eventually pointing the exact same weapon at your own chest. That is the part that does not make sense strategically, and it is the part that makes me question whether Drake is actually behind this at all, or whether something else is happening. Because here is the alternative theory, and I want you to genuinely consider it before you decide. It is entirely possible that nobody paid anybody. It is entirely possible that these creators are doing this for free, and that the free version is actually more disturbing than the paid version. Think about the incentive structure that has been built over the last 3 years. We know Drake watches. That is not speculation. He follows accounts that attack the people he does not like. He engages. He acknowledges. He has been documented showing appreciation to creators who take shots on his behalf. And once an entire class of creators figures out that a billionaire artist is watching and that his attention is the currency, you do not need to pay anybody anymore. The audition never stops. The bounty is attention itself. That is how a coordinated campaign forms without a single dollar changing hands. Not through contracts. Through recognition. Through the possibility of being noticed. Through the hope of being pulled up into the orbit. You get an entire ecosystem of people racing each other to see who can be the most useful, and the output is indistinguishable from a paid operation because the timing, the framing, and the targets all aligned anyway. So which is it? Purchased or volunteered? Because both answers are ugly, and only one of them is illegal. Let me keep building, because there is more here and it gets heavier. Because there is a detail in this story that has been almost completely buried under the noise, and it is the detail that should be leading every single report. One security guard's deposition is being treated by the internet as a closed case. Understand what a deposition actually is. It is sworn testimony given during the discovery phase of a civil proceeding. It is not a conviction. It is not an indictment. It is not a grand jury finding. It is one human being's recollection of a violent, chaotic, crowded minute that happened 5 years ago in a swarm of bodies in a backstage area where multiple accounts have described masks, weapons, and total confusion. Other accounts from that same night have described the person who delivered the fatal wound as wearing a mask. Now hold both of those things in your head at once. A masked assailant, according to some accounts, and a named artist, according to one guard's memory of the same 60 seconds. Those two things do not automatically reconcile, and a functioning press would spend its time on that gap. Instead, an entire content economy took the single most inflammatory sentence out of a deposition, detached it from every qualifier around it, and manufactured a verdict out of it inside of 72 hours. That is the actual crime being committed in public right now, and it does not require anybody to have been paid. And here is why it matters so much more than a normal internet pile-on. Drakeo the Ruler already lived through exactly this. This is the part that should make everybody watching feel physically uncomfortable. Drakeo the Ruler was prosecuted using the same architecture. His lyrics were used against him. His associations were used against him. His words were read back to him in a courtroom as if a rap verse were a confession. He beat it, and it took years of his life, and then he was killed a short time after getting free. So the idea that the culture would now respond to his death by running the exact same playbook on somebody else, building a public prosecution out of vibes, selective quotes, and algorithmic momentum, is not just hypocritical. It is a betrayal of the specific injustice that Drakeo the Ruler survived before he died. And that is the thing Glasses Malone was actually screaming about underneath the anger. He is not defending a murder. He is not saying nobody did anything. He said it plainly, and this is important. He said this is gang business, and he is not standing here claiming to know who did what. What he is saying is that a homicide file should not be litigated by content creators who profit off the outcome, and that if somebody is funding that process, that person has done something far worse than any disrecord. Now let us talk about the position YG is actually in, because it is genuinely one of the strangest positions any artist has been in during this era. YG has never been charged. YG has never been named a suspect. YG was detained and released. And YG is simultaneously being tried, convicted, and sentenced daily on platforms that reach more people than any newspaper in the country. That gap between his legal status and his public status is enormous, and that gap is exactly where careers get destroyed. Because here is how this actually works in practice. Prosecutors do not live in a vacuum. Detectives do not live in a vacuum. Grand jurors do not live in a vacuum. Public pressure is a real force in a real investigation. And if you flood the environment with content for long enough, you can change the temperature around a case even if you never produce a single piece of evidence. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is how narrative pressure has functioned in high-profile cases for decades. Which means if somebody actually is financing this, they are not just talking. They are attempting to influence the operating environment of a homicide investigation. And that is a category of behavior that has nothing to do with rap. So YG responded. And the response was not a song, and it was not a press statement written by a lawyer. YG hit the internet with what people immediately described as a red alert, and the temperature of it told you everything about where his head is. This is a man who has watched a narrative form around him in real time, watched a deposition line get amplified into a verdict, watched his name get attached to the death of a peer, And watched it all accelerate the same week. He had the biggest competitive win of his recent career. Think about that sequence one more time, because the timing is genuinely surreal. YG gets detained. YG gets released. YG performs. YG wins decisively. And within days, the machine turns on at full volume. I am not telling you what that means. I am telling you that the sequence is the story, and the sequence is what made Glasses Malone snap. Now let me deal with the other name in this, because the game is in this story and almost nobody is examining that thread properly. YG went up against the game in that Verzuz. The game has been publicly aligned with Drake throughout this entire era, openly, repeatedly, and without apology, including through the period where the rest of Los Angeles moved in the opposite direction. So you have a matchup where one man is aligned with Drake, the other man is not, and the man who is not gets detained in a murder investigation days before the event. Then YG wins anyway. Overwhelmingly. And then the campaign intensifies. I want to be extremely careful here, because I am not accusing the game of anything, and there is no evidence whatsoever that the game had any involvement in any part of this. But the optics of that arrangement, the alignment, the timing, and the fallout are all part of why the culture reacted the way it did. When you are looking at a pattern, you look at everything sitting inside the frame, and the game's public loyalty to Drake during a period when Los Angeles turned on him is a permanent part of this frame whether anybody likes it or not. Now, the pushback. Let me steelman the other side properly, because a lot of channels will not. The strongest argument against Glasses Malone's claim is simple. Drake does not need to do this. He is arguably the most commercially successful artist alive. He has an infinite platform, an infinite budget, and infinite reach. Financing a whisper campaign about a homicide through third parties in a city that already dislikes him over a battle he was not even in is an insane risk to accept for an almost invisible reward. If it ever came out, if a single text message ever surfaced, it would be the most damaging thing ever attached to his name. It would dwarf every allegation that came before it. That is a real argument. That is a genuinely strong argument. And a lot of very reasonable people are landing there, including creators who have no love for Drake at all. But here is my honest position, and I am going to say it plainly. I do not think Drake would be smart to do this. But I do not believe for one second that he is incapable of doing it. Those are two entirely different statements, and the internet keeps collapsing them into one. The question is not whether it would be wise. The question is whether the person in question has demonstrated a pattern of using money and information as weapons. And we have watched that demonstration happen in public more than once. So when somebody like Glasses Malone, who is from that city, who is connected in ways that most commentators are not, who has correctly read the room on multiple major situations before the rest of the industry caught up, gets on a live stream and says he knows what is happening, I am not going to sit here and pretend that is worth nothing just because he did not attach a receipt. I am also not going to tell you it is proven. It is not proven. Say it with me. It is not proven. What it is credible enough to demand actual scrutiny, and that scrutiny is exactly what the ecosystem is refusing to apply. And now we arrive at the part that makes this bigger than Drake, bigger than YG, and bigger than any of the personalities involved. We have built an entire industry that monetizes unsolved murders. Sit with that. The death of Drakeo the Ruler has generated an unfathomable amount of content over 5 years. Thumbnails. Red circles. Arrows. All caps titles. Speculation presented as insider knowledge. Theories stacked on theories. And through all of it, through every one of those millions of views, not one person has been charged. Not one. The content economy around this man's death has been more productive than the investigation into it. That is obscene, and everybody participating knows it is obscene, and it keeps happening because the numbers are too good to walk away from. And this is where the campaign question stops being about him specifically. Because whether or not a single dollar was ever spent, the machine works the same way. You do not need a paymaster when the incentive structure already rewards the exact behavior a paymaster would request. The algorithm is the patron. Outrage is the salary. And an unsolved homicide involving famous people is the single most profitable raw material available. So even if Glasses Malone is completely wrong about the financing, he is completely right about the outcome. A coordinated wave hit YG. It hit at the exact moment he was most vulnerable and most visible. It used a legal fragment as a weapon. And it was executed by people who profit from it. Now let me close the loop on something I opened earlier, because I promised you the part that flips it. Here is what almost nobody has said out loud. The person who benefits most from this entire situation is not Drake, and it is not YG, and it is not any blogger. It is whoever actually killed Drakeo the Ruler. Read that again. 5 years. No charges. And now the entire public conversation has been redirected into a rap feud, into a blogger war, into a debate about who is paying who, into an argument about live stream threats and rented power and Verzuz scores. Every hour the culture spends arguing about alleged invoices is an hour nobody spends asking why a homicide with thousands of witnesses has produced zero accountability in half a decade. That is the real story. That is the thing underneath all of this noise. And the noise is so loud, so profitable, and so emotionally satisfying that we may never get back to it. Drakeo the Ruler was a father. He was an artist who changed the sound of an entire coast. He beat a system that was built to bury him, and then he was killed in a crowd, and the people who loved him have spent 5 years watching his death get turned into content while the case goes nowhere. So when I watch a wave of videos appear overnight, all pointed at one man, all built on one line from one deposition, all published by accounts that have a documented history of moving information, I do not have to believe Drake wrote a check to know that something ugly is happening. Something ugly is happening either way. Now let me get practical, because I want you leaving this with something usable instead of just angry. Here is how you read the next 30 days of this story. The first thing to watch is whether any actual evidence surfaces regarding financing. Not a claim. Not a subtweet. An actual artifact. A message, a payment record, a creator flipping and going public. If that ever appears, this becomes the biggest story in the history of modern rap, and it will not be close, because it moves from cultural warfare into potential interference with a homicide investigation. The second thing to watch is the legal track. Watch whether the district attorney's office does anything at all. Watch whether the deposition testimony gets corroborated by any second witness or any physical evidence. One person's sworn recollection is a starting point. 2 independent accounts plus physical corroboration is a case. Right now there is no public indication that the second thing exists. The third thing to watch is whether YG says anything substantive beyond the red alert. Whether he speaks in detail, whether he speaks through counsel, or whether he goes silent. Silence in his position is often a lawyer's instruction, not an admission, and the internet will absolutely treat it as an admission anyway. The fourth thing to watch is Glasses Malone himself. Does he escalate, or does he pull back? He explicitly said he has been holding back, that there is material he has not touched because it is not public, and that he could turn all of this up whenever he wants. If he starts releasing specifics, this changes shape entirely. If he goes quiet, the internet will decide that means something, and the internet will probably be wrong about what. And the fifth thing, the thing I want you to actually take with you, is to watch the pattern. Not the personalities, the pattern. Watch what happens the next time somebody in this culture takes a public position against Drake. Watch how fast the response arrives. Watch whether it comes from the same handful of accounts. Watch whether the framing is identical. Watch whether the timing is coincidental. Because if it happens again, exactly the way it happened here, exactly the way it happened with Charlemagne, exactly the way it happened with every other person who stepped out of line, then at a certain point the word coincidence stops being an honest description of what you are looking at. I want to be clear about my own position one final time before I let this go, because I do not want a single sentence of this taken out of context. I am not accusing Drake of financing anything. I have no evidence that he financed anything, and neither does anybody else who is currently saying it. I am not accusing DJ Academics, Poetic Flacco, or Trap Lore Ross of taking money. There is no proof any of those three received a single dollar, and it is entirely possible they are simply covering a story that is genuinely enormous and doing it aggressively because that is the job. I am not accusing YG of anything either, and I want that on the record just as loudly. He has not been charged. He has not been named a suspect. He has consistently denied any involvement. And the presumption of innocence is not something we suspend because a thumbnail was compelling. What I am saying is that Glasses Malone made a specific, serious, named accusation on a live stream, that he did it with his full chest, that he has been right about the temperature of this industry before, and that the pattern he is describing is observable by anybody willing to look at it honestly. And I am saying that the way this culture has processed the death of Drakeo the Ruler over the last 5 years has been a disgrace, and that this current wave is the ugliest version of it yet, regardless of who is or is not funding it. Because let me take you back to where we started, and let me close the circle properly. I opened this by telling you somebody accused the biggest artist alive of spending money to put another man in a cage. And that is still the headline. That is still the accusation. But now you know what sits underneath it, and now you know why it landed the way it landed. It landed because the pattern is real, even if the payment is not proven. It landed because Drake's history with information as a weapon is documented, not imagined. It landed because YG's legal status and YG's public status have been forced into two completely different realities. It landed because Glasses Malone is not a random voice, and the industry's silence toward him is louder than any denial anybody could have issued. And it landed because a man was killed in front of thousands of people 5 years ago, and the only thing that has been successfully manufactured since then is content. Now here is what I genuinely believe, and this is the last thing I will give you before I ask for yours. I believe the financing claim is unproven and may stay unproven forever, because that kind of arrangement, if it exists at all, does not leave paperwork lying around where a rapper on a live stream can find it. I believe the coordination is real, but I think it is mostly volunteer coordination, and I think that is worse. I think we built a system where a billionaire's approval is worth more than a paycheck, and an entire generation of commentators will burn a man's freedom down for the chance to be acknowledged by it. I believe YG is in genuine danger, not from a knife, but from a narrative, because narratives have put people in cells before with far less than this. And I believe the only person who has actually won anything in the last 2 weeks is a person nobody has named, in a case nobody has closed, about a murder nobody has answered for. So, let me put the questions to you, because I want to read every single one of these answers. First question. Do you think Drake is financing this campaign against YG, or do you think these creators are doing it for free, chasing his attention like it is currency? Be honest, and be specific about why. Second question. Should one security guard's deposition be enough for the internet to convict a man who has never been charged? Where's your line? Because everybody has a line, and most people have never actually thought about where theirs is. Third question. Was Glasses Malone right to say what he said on that live stream, or did he go too far when he moved from exposure into threats? I have my own opinion on that, and I already told you what it is, but I want to know if you think he crossed something he cannot walk back. And the last one, the one I care about most. Why has nobody been charged in the death of Drakeo the Ruler? 5 years. Thousands of witnesses. Cameras everywhere. A festival with security, staff, credentials, and footage. And nothing. If your answer to that is complicated, then you already understand why this story feels so rotten from top to bottom. Drop all of it in the comments, because this is the conversation that actually matters, and I read every one of them. I will be in there with you. If this breakdown gave you something the rest of your feed did not, do me the favor. Hit that like button, because it genuinely decides whether a video like this gets seen or gets buried, and this is exactly the kind of subject that platforms would rather not push. Subscribe if you are new here, because I promise you this story is not finished. Not even close. When the next piece drops, whether that is Glasses Malone releasing something specific, whether that is YG speaking in full, whether that is a second witness surfacing, or whether that is the district attorney's office finally moving after 5 years of nothing, we are covering it here first, and we are covering it without picking a side to protect. And listen, if you made it this far, you already know how this ecosystem works. You already know that the loudest version of a story is almost never the truest version, and you already know that the people screaming the most confidently are usually the people who have read the least. So do not take my word as gospel either. Go look at the timeline yourself. Go read the actual reporting on that deposition instead of a thumbnail about it. Go watch the Glasses Malone stream in full instead of the 90-second clip somebody cut to make him look unhinged. Go look at how many videos dropped in that 72-hour window, and go look at who published them. Build your own conclusion, because that is the only kind of conclusion that is worth anything. And when you are done with that, I have got one more thing for you, and it is directly connected to everything you just heard. Because there is another layer to how these narrative campaigns get built, who funds the ecosystem that hosts them, and how a single account can move an entire culture's opinion in under a day. I broke that whole machine down piece by piece, and once you see how it operates, you will never look at your recommended feed the same way again. It is sitting right there next to this one. Go watch it right now, because after everything I just laid out about Drake, YG, Glasses Malone, and the death of Drakeo the Ruler, that video is the other half of the picture. I appreciate every single one of you for riding with me on a subject this heavy. Stay tapped in. Peace.